I think what Henry VIII did for making the Tudors a subject of romantic intrigue for fiction writers and filmmakers throughout history is something, you know, we need to thank him for that, actually. I think that there were always, I mean, kings have always had mistresses, but I think what happened in Henry VIII's reign was so unprecedented. In a sense, he didn't want to have mistresses. He wanted to marry his mistresses. He didn't want to just keep his queen that had been, you know, raised to be a queen. She was from a very illustrious royal family of Spain, and he needed his male heir, but he, you know, I mean, people have described him as a serial monogamist. And in a sense, you know, I think that's not so far from a kind of truth. It's impossible to know. But there was a kind of shift, and I think that there's been a focus on romance from there on in. And I mean, we do have latter-day similarities. There's Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. She married 8 times, and there were all these love triangles. I think there was Eddie Fisher, Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor. And then that love triangle morphed into Elizabeth Taylor, Eddie Fisher and Richard Burton. And she married Richard Burton twice. I mean, she's better at it than Henry VIII. And you've got the Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, the affairs. You've got Charles and Camilla. I mean, that wouldn't have happened previously, I think. The royalty were expected to have affairs, and I think it's only nowadays that people expect their husbands to be faithful. I know it's a terrible thing to say. I'll be kind of have rotten eggs thrown at me, but I think in the past women really put up and shut up, and I think nowadays there's this focus on adultery because it's become so much more exposed. I think people have been fascinated by love stories and stories of adultery since the days of courtly love. Just think of Lancelot and Guinevere. That's another great love triangle. So it's not really a new thing. It's just something we love to focus on. Women in power is a theme throughout. Well, it's something of fascination to me, so it always ends up in my writing. But I think you can't compare notions of power and women with the people I'm writing about in the early modern period. Those women, Catherine Parr, Queen Elizabeth, Mary Tudor, they don't compare to powerful women nowadays. So Hillary Clinton, or I'm thinking of now the women's hour power list. You've got people like J.K. Rowling on that. These are people who have had an opportunity to carve out a place for themselves in the world and really have a voice. Whereas you take a figure like Catherine Parr, she struggled to have a voice. She wrote 2 devotional books. That was the only way she could really make herself heard. Women's power then was so strongly mediated through the men in these women's lives. They had to find ways to be heard. Whereas nowadays women have freedom, they can hold high office. Look at Angela Merkel. I mean, it's astonishing the power she has. She's really the key person in the whole Eurozone. And I think even where you've got a queen like Elizabeth, that power, she had to cleverly manipulate her power. And she couldn't marry, she couldn't be seen to be weak in any way. Whereas I don't think that's the case now. I think it's happily, it's very different for women now. Well, the term she-wolf was given to a series of women. I think Margaret of Anjou was called a she-wolf. I think perhaps Catherine de Valois was called a she-wolf. Isabella of Spain. Basically, she-wolf was a label for any woman who had power and was in some small way ruthless with it, and was the enemy. It wasn't. It was a term that was. It was a label for people who wanted to denigrate that powerful woman. I think Margaret Thatcher's enemies might have called her a she-wolf. They said she was a bad mother, didn't she? And I think that's a strong characteristic that's an overhang from this, medieval, early modern period. It's like you can't be a woman. It's unwomanly. It's unnatural to be powerful and be a woman. And I think Margaret Thatcher had that. She doesn't care for her children. And so her detractors were always bringing up things that would make her seem less womanly. And, she was described even by the people who supported her as the Iron Maiden. So, and in a sense, I think Elizabeth played into that trope as well, that idea of being sort of somehow more than a woman, not just she wanted to portray herself as not a woman in the conventional sense, and yet as very womanly, because in those days it would have been impossible not to portray yourself as not womanly. It would have been seen to be something really horrendous. So she had to be above all women in a sense. And I think Margaret Thatcher had a little bit of that. And so, yeah, she might have been called a she-wolf. I'm sure people called Elizabeth a she-wolf as well, the people that didn't like her. I'm sure the Spaniards did, whatever the Spanish term is. I don't know what it is. I don't think you can really compare the monarchy of today with the monarchy of the 16th century. It was absolute rule in those days. You couldn't have a figure like Henry VIII nowadays, a completely tyrannical rule. You couldn't have a figure like Elizabeth I. Now I think the monarchy there is no real power political power attached to the monarchy. I mean, they're influential. The Queen came #1 in the women in power list that I mentioned, but she's not really got power, or I suppose she doesn't use the power that she might have. I think Prince Charles will sometimes have a strong opinion about something, and it's listened to. He has a voice. So in a sense, the monarchy do have a voice. People will listen. The Queen very rarely makes her own opinions about anything political known. I can't remember an instance when she's done that. But if she were to do that, she would be listened to. But in a sense, there is no power attached to the throne. And I think it's a radically different setup, the royal family now. I think there is no comparison, really. In the 16th century, it was assumed you loved your monarch. I mean, it was impossible that you didn't love your monarch. That was what was required of the subjects, was to have total and utter obedience and admiration for their king or queen. Whereas nowadays, I get the impression it's much more that the monarchy has to keep their favour. They have to keep behaving in a way that means they retain the favour of the people of the country. And so that's a huge shift, really. But I think we love a celebration. I think you can see from the Jubilee celebrations, everybody getting out and that regatta on the river. It was a wonderful way to celebrate something that is really, I mean, in a sense, it is outmoded. Its role is always coming up for question. But in a sense, I think the British people enjoy it. They enjoy those celebrations. I mean, the whole world, look at how the whole world was waiting for that baby. I mean, in a sense, I'm slightly disappointed it wasn't a girl, because that would have been constitutionally very interesting. And it would have sort of had a link back to that time where there were no boys in the succession. They had to have queens. It would have been a lovely, in a sense, it would have been lovely to know that there was a girl who would have inherited over some male heirs. I think there's a fascination about it. There's a fascination about it even without the power. And I can't really explain that.